more fans worldwide. It's indeed the golden age of K-culture. But with this growing interest comes an increase in misinformation about Korea. There's so much inaccurate information out there. Even AI can sometimes get it wrong. So, we must set things straight and correct all the misinformation. So here's the plan. The Voluntary Agency Network of Korea, VANG, and Arirang TV present the Get Korea Right project. Our goal is to provide accurate information on important keywords that come to mind when we think of Korea. Blatant errors and false claims that distort history. It's time to set the record straight, sharing the true history and culture of Korea while raising the national brand. Let's get started with Get Korea Right. Are you ready to join?
In our headlines on this Tuesday, May 26th, here in South Korea, U.S. President Donald Trump says he'll sign, quote, a great deal with Iran or there will be no deal at all, while Iran acknowledges tangible advances in peace talks but insists a deal is not, quote, imminent. Meanwhile, prospects of peace in the Middle East sent oil prices tumbling, which in turn pushed up the South Korean stock market past the 8,000 mark as foreign investors sought semiconductors. And President Lee Jae-myung calls for an active fiscal policy in the second half of this year in preparation for crucial changes once the conflict in the Middle East comes to an end. We begin with the latest out of the Trump administration with regard to its standoff with Tehran. Now, there have been reports of fresh U.S. strikes in southern Iran just hours after Donald Trump claimed peace talks were proceeding, quote, nicely. Our Cho Young-eun starts us off.
U.S. Central Command said Monday that U.S. forces carried out self-defense strikes in southern Iran, targeting missile launch sites and Iranian boats allegedly attempting to lay mines during the ongoing ceasefire. Explosions were reported in the port city of Bandar Abbas, with Iranian media saying the situation is under control. Earlier Monday, U.S. President Donald Trump said negotiations with Iran toward a deal to end the war were proceeding nicely, but warned that if diplomacy fails, U.S. attacks would resume on a scale bigger and stronger than ever before. Writing on Truth Social, Trump said the deal with Iran would either be a great and meaningful one or there will be no deal. His remarks come amid criticism from both Democrats and some Republicans who worry a deal could ease pressure on Tehran while leaving Iran's nuclear program intact. On the same day, Trump insisted that Iran's enriched uranium stockpile must either be handed over to the United States or destroyed under the oversight of the International Atomic Energy Agency. A senior U.S. official said Iran had agreed in principle to dispose of the highly enriched uranium, with details of the mechanism still being discussed. Trump also called for countries including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Pakistan, Egypt, Jordan, and Turkey to join the Abraham Accords as part of broader efforts tied to negotiations with Iran. He said he spoke with leaders from those countries, including the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, which already signed the normalization agreements with Israel. Trump said on social media that those nations will welcome Iran into the accords once a deal to end the conflict is reached. The comments follow an Axios report from Saturday, which said that Washington and Tehran are discussing a framework agreement that could include extending a ceasefire for 60 days, reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and continuing talks over Iran's nuclear program. 조영은, Arirang News.
Iran, for its part, has acknowledged tangible advances in peace talks with the U.S., but dismissed talk about a deal being, quote, imminent. Our Lee Seung-jae reports.
Iran says progress has been made in talks with the United States aimed at ending the 3-month conflict in the Persian Gulf, but cautioned that a final agreement is not yet close. Speaking at a weekly briefing on Monday, Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghaei said negotiators had reached conclusions on many issues, but stressed that this did not mean a deal was imminent.
It is true that we have reached a conclusion regarding a large part of the topics under discussion, but to say that this means the signing of an agreement is imminent, no one can make such a claim.
He added that current discussions are focused primarily on ending the war and lifting the U.S. naval blockade around the Strait of Hormuz, rather than on Iran's nuclear program. According to Baghaei, a proposed 14-point memorandum of understanding would center on restoring safe passage through the strategic waterway in exchange for Iranian guarantees on maritime security. However, he also criticized the shifting positions by U.S. officials, saying they have complicated efforts to reach an agreement. On Monday, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Washington would continue to give diplomacy every opportunity before considering what he called alternatives. His comments followed President Donald Trump's announcement that he had instructed American negotiators not to rush into a deal with Tehran. Despite some progress in peace talks, the two sides remain divided over several key issues, including Iran's nuclear ambitions, Tehran's demands for sanctions relief, and access to billions of dollars in frozen oil revenues overseas, as well as the ongoing conflict between Israel and the Iran-backed Hezbollah group in Lebanon. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the Kremlin has warned foreign nationals and diplomats to leave the Ukrainian capital city as soon as possible, as it pledges to launch a series of systematic strikes against Kyiv. Our Cha Yun-kyung has more.
Russia warned on Monday local time that it will carry out deadly, large-scale airstrikes against Ukraine, days after attacks on the Ukrainian capital. Russia's foreign ministry said in a statement that decision-making centers, command posts, and drone manufacturing facilities will be the target of the new strikes in response to the Ukrainian attack on Friday local time. According to Ukrainian authorities, Russia carried out strikes on Saturday night, killing 4 and injuring more than 90 people in Kyiv. Moscow has called for foreign nationals and diplomats to leave Kyiv as soon as possible. During a phone call on Monday local time, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov urged U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio to evacuate U.S. staff from its embassy in Kyiv. Russia has been in retaliation after accusing Ukraine of carrying out a deadly attack on a student dormitory in an occupied part of eastern Ukraine on Friday. According to Russian authorities, at least 16 people were killed and 42 were injured in the town of Starobilsk in the Luhansk region. In return, Ukraine's defense forces struck oil refineries in Russia's Bryansk region in return on Monday night. Ukraine has constantly targeted oil depots in Russia by using drones, causing operations to stop at facilities that account for roughly 25% of domestic gasoline production. Cha Yun-kyung, Arirang News.
Here on the Korean Peninsula, North Korea launched short-range ballistic missiles toward the West Sea earlier on this Tuesday afternoon. Now, South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff says the missiles were detected at around 1 p.m. originating from North Korea's Cheongju area in Pyeongbuk-do province and flew some 80 kilometers. Intelligence officials here and their U.S. counterparts shared relevant information and tracked related movements from the early stages of the launch, while exchanging data with neighboring Japan as well. The latest launch marks North Korea's first ballistic missile provocation in 37 days and its 8th ballistic missile launch this year. South Korea has made public its first formal nuclear-powered submarine plan based on non-proliferation principles. The plan was released by the Defense Ministry on this Tuesday, with the envisioned submarines targeted for launch in the mid-2030s and deployment in the late 2030s. The submarines will use low-enriched uranium reactors, be built domestically, and remain under U.S. coordination and IAEA safeguards. President Lee Jae-myung, for his part, says the nuclear-powered submarines will symbolize South Korea's resolve to resume responsibility for peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. Defense officials from Seoul and Washington today begin their joint search for the remains of American soldiers who lost their lives during the Korean War. The month-long endeavor covers 6 areas, including Hongcheon in Gangwon-do province and Yangpyeong in Gyeonggi-do province, where the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division suffered significant losses. Both teams have pledged close coordination to ensure the success of the joint investigation. The local bourse has reclaimed the 8,000 mark as investors bet big on chips amid a global tech rally and a drop in oil prices on prospects of peace in the Middle East. Our Park Chun-an covers Tuesday's rally.
Korea's benchmark KOSPI has reclaimed the 8,000 mark, closing at an all-time high of 8,047 points on Tuesday. The rally was largely driven by the return of foreign investors. Their purchases were heavily concentrated in the semiconductor sector. As a result, the nation's tech giants saw historic milestones, with Samsung Electronics crossing the 300,000 won mark at one point and SK hynix surpassing 2 million won. This surge reflects broader global momentum fueled by the artificial intelligence boom, which has led to high returns for investors worldwide. Another major factor lifting investor sentiment is the sharp drop in international oil prices. With growing expectations of a U.S.-Iran ceasefire agreement, U.S. crude futures plunged over 6% to around $90 a barrel, while Brent crude fell below $100 for the first time since late April. Because Korea relies heavily on energy imports, the stock market is particularly sensitive to these stabilizing oil prices. However, market analysts warn of potential short-term volatility.
Many investors remain concerned about whether semiconductor stocks can continue rising, given the sector's history of sharp earnings volatility. However, U.S. big tech companies driving demand for chips are still posting very strong earnings, which continue to support the market. Valuations are certainly stretched compared to past levels, so there might be some pressure. But for now, there do not appear to be many clear warning signs pointing to an immediate reversal.
Furthermore, despite hopes for peace, experts remain cautious due to high interest rates. As U.S. big tech firms have been issuing corporate bonds to finance massive data center investments, elevated borrowing costs could indirectly affect semiconductor companies' earnings as well. In particular, uncertainty surrounding the U.S. Federal Reserve's policy path, especially following the appointment of new Fed Chair Kevin Warsh, could weigh on market sentiment going forward. Park Chun-an, Arirang News.
In other news, President Lee Jae-myung has highlighted the importance of pursuing an active fiscal policy in the second half of this year to allow for economic stability ahead of a tangible growth strategy. Our correspondent Yoon Jung-min reports.
Deploying economic measures is necessary to preemptively address developments that will unfold after the war ends in the Middle East. This was according to President Lee Jae-myung at Tuesday's cabinet meeting, which also serves as an emergency economic meeting, as the South Korean government draws up its economic strategy for the second half of 2026.
올해가 잠재 성장률 반등의 원년이 되도록 재정의 적극적 역할을 바탕으로 치밀하고 속도감 있는 정책 대응을 당부드립니다.
He also called for tightening belts to conserve funds so they can be used in areas deemed essential.
불효불급한 재정 지출은 과감하게 줄여야 합니다. 국민이 맡긴 세금과 권력을 오로지 국민만을 위해서 제대로 잘 사용하는 것이 바로 우리의 책임입니다.
Officials noted that the country's nominal growth rate is expected to reach nearly 10% this year, as they say the local economy grew and recovered fast despite the prolonged Middle East conflict.
As growth improves, tax revenue will increase, and these are likely to push up prices and interest rates. We will try to minimize those concerns as we devise a growth strategy plan fit for the new era.
On top of imminent tasks to tamp down higher prices, the authorities plan to embark on structural reform in the public, financial, and labor sectors.
지속적으로 우상향할 수 있게 하는 게 정말로 중요한 것 같아요. 그러려면 우리 사회의 모든 분야를 다 바꿔야 됩니다.
Officials call the timing a golden hour for an economic rebound. It also coincides with the start of President Lee's second year in office after taking the oath of office last June. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
On the entertainment front, K-pop sensation BTS has claimed yet again the top prize at the American Music Awards. Our culture correspondent Park Gonu covers this feat and more.
Members looked stunned while some hugged each other with joy. The reactions came as BTS was announced the winner of the top honor, Artist of the Year, at the 2026 American Music Awards held in Las Vegas on Monday local time. It marked the group's second win in the category following its historic victory in 2021, when BTS became the first Asian act to receive the award, before members began their mandatory military service.
Thank you. It's an honor to have this precious award once again after everybody done their military service. Like the legendary Busta Rhymes said, it's a fan-voted award, so our biggest thanks and gratitude, as always, goes to the armies all over the world.
The group beat out 9 other nominees, including Bad Bunny and Taylor Swift, to claim the award. BTS at the AMAs also picked up 2 additional trophies: Song of the Summer for Swim, the lead track from its latest album Arirang, and Best Male K-pop Artist, sweeping all 3 categories in which the group was nominated. While AMA is considered one of the 3 major U.S. music awards alongside the Grammys and Billboard Music Awards, the AMAs are widely seen as a stronger reflection of public popularity, as winners are determined through fan votes after nominees are selected over factors including streaming numbers and album sales. With BTS sweeping awards at the AMAs just 2 months after the album's release, attention is also drawn to whether BTS will be able to win a trophy at the upcoming Grammys next February. BTS hasn't won a Grammy so far. Also at the ceremony, K-pop Demon Hunters took home 4 trophies, including Song of the Year for Golden from its soundtrack and Best Soundtrack. Singer-songwriter EJ thanked fans for helping the song in the film gain tremendous support. In addition, Korea-U.S. collaborative K-pop group KATSEYE also emerged as another standout winner, earning 3 awards, including New Artist of the Year. The members also expressed gratitude toward BTS for helping expand global interest in their genre. KATSEYE also performed its latest track release, Pinky Up. With multiple K-pop acts taking home major honors at this year's AMAs, expectations are growing for the genre to further expand its global dominance. Park Gonu, Arirang News.
And on the local silver screen, the K-production Kunche, also known as Colony in English, attracted over 2 million moviegoers as of this past Monday, just 5 days following its release last Thursday. This achievement is a new box office milestone and beats that of the blockbuster The King's Warden that surpassed the 2 million mark on day 12 following its release. Kunche, or Colony, depicts the story of survivors trapped inside a sealed building after a mysterious infection outbreak. And speaking about an outbreak, the scale and speed of the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo are sounding alarm bells across health organizations worldwide. Our Jin reports.
World Health Organization Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus has said that the pace Ebola is spreading is outpacing containment efforts. According to authorities from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, cumulative confirmed cases have risen to 101, and the cumulative suspected cases to 930. Suspected Ebola deaths have been tallied at 221. Centered in the Ituri province in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, Ebola has spread to 11 areas, including North and South Kivu provinces. Neighboring Uganda reported 2 new cases on Monday, both health workers, bringing its total confirmed cases to 7. Dr. Ghebreyesus also said on Monday during a virtual ministerial briefing that responders are playing catch-up after a weeks-long detection delay and warned the outbreak is likely to get worse before it gets better. He plans to travel to the epicenter of the virus in the Democratic Republic of Congo on Tuesday. Declared a public health emergency of international concern by the WHO, this is Congo's 17th Ebola outbreak. However, the specific Budibugyo species of Ebola that is spreading is rare, with no vaccines or medications, making it harder to treat. The WHO said last week it could take up to 9 months for a vaccine. Amid efforts to isolate patients and trace transmission routes, local police in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo on Sunday had to fire shots in the air after angry crowds demanded they reclaim the bodies of loved ones who died from the virus. Meanwhile, the WHO and the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have unveiled a 6-month Ebola response plan. With a $319 million budget, the plan covers all 55 African Union member states. $265 million is allocated for outbreak response in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda, while $54 million will go towards preparedness efforts in 10 high-risk African countries. Jin, Arirang News.
This is The World Now, bringing you everything you need to know from around the globe. In Japan, 26 people at a Tokyo mall developed throat pain and felt unwell after a person allegedly sprayed an unknown substance. Dozens of emergency vehicles and responders in hazmat suits were deployed to the Ginza 6 shopping complex on Monday, and surrounding roads were temporarily closed. 19 of those affected were taken to hospital. All were conscious with their symptoms described as mild. Police found traces of what appeared to be pepper spray on a nearby wall. Authorities said they are searching for a man seen on security footage spraying something inside the mall before fleeing the scene. The suspect has not been identified and an investigation is underway. In Angola, a landslide and an illegal gold mine has killed at least 28 people. Local authorities said the landslide on Saturday at the mine in Bengo province was one of Angola's deadliest mining disasters. All victims were aged between 16 and 35 years old. 13 of the dead were from the same family. 4 people were rescued. Provincial authorities estimate around 7,000 illegal miners are currently operating in Bengo province alone. Illegal gold mining has surged in Angola as falling diamond prices have pushed workers toward gold and other metals. Britain recorded its hottest ever day in the month of May on Monday. Temperatures at Kew Gardens in London reached 34.8 degrees Celsius. The United Kingdom's National Weather and Climate Service said the reading broke the previous May record of 32.8 degrees set in both 1922 and 1944. It was also the hottest public holiday on record since Met Office records began in 1884. Wales also recorded its hottest day in May at 32.2 degrees. Ahead of the heat wave, the UK government issued an amber heat alert for large parts of England. Weather forecasters say Tuesday could see temperatures as high as 35 degrees. Chu Ji-han, Arirang News.
Heavy rain is sweeping across the country today. It'll be especially intense across southern regions and Jeju Island. In particular, the south coast and mountainous areas of Jeju Island could see downpours of around 50 millimeters per hour at times. A heavy rain warning remains in effect for the mountainous areas of Jeju Island, where more than 250 millimeters is expected through tomorrow. The south coast could receive over 150, while parts of the central regions may receive up to 60 millimeters. Also, strong winds will accompany the rain. Mountainous areas of Jeju Island are currently under a strong wind advisory and could see wind gusts exceeding 25 meters per second through early tomorrow morning. Tomorrow's Seoul will start the day at 21 degrees, Chuncheon at 18 degrees, Daegu at 19 degrees. Then by the afternoon, Seoul will get up to 25 degrees, Daegu at 22 degrees, Gwangju at 28 degrees. Once the rain clears, sunny skies will be back, and temperatures will gradually climb again. But with large day-to-night temperature swings of around 15 degrees, make sure to dress accordingly.
Those are the headlines at the hour here in South Korea. Coming up right after this break is our daily panel session, so do stay with us, and thank you for now.
A smile passed down to us across time. Why are people so captivated by it? In the vast exhibition hall, filling the empty space, stand just two sculptures. They are the pensive bodhisattvas, carried across some 14 centuries. Created about 50 years apart in the Three Kingdoms period, the two figures resemble each other but differ in beauty. The one on the left, from the late 6th century, wears a pointed crown engraved with the sun and moon, while a silk-like drapery flows gently over its shoulders. In contrast, the figure on the right, crafted in the 7th century, makes a striking impression with its simplicity and restraint. A plain, three-peaked crown, bare chest with only two necklaces. Unlike the lightly incised folds of the left, the right feels weighty and dynamic, like heavy cloth. Lower your gaze, and you'll notice remarkable detail at the feet. While the late 6th century figure appears still and contemplative, its toes extended in a straight line rendered with shallow incisions. The figure on the right seems to gather strength in a fleeting moment of contemplation. Its toes, slightly curled, conveying a vivid sense of dynamic vitality. Two distinct figures, yet in these tranquil smiles from 1500 years ago, we find a quiet comfort for our weary lives.
The Trump administration says it will give diplomacy every chance to succeed before considering another way to deal with Iran. With more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Tuesday, May 26th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. Later this week, we mark 3 months since the U.S. and Israel launched a military offensive against Iran amid efforts to eradicate the latter's nuclear ambitions and more. For the latest, I have independent journalist Kelly Kasulis-Jo with us. Kelly, welcome back.
Honored to be here, thanks.
I also have Professor Hannah Kim at Seogang University joining our talk virtually. Professor Kim, as always, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Kelly, we start here in the studio. Let's begin with news of fresh U.S. strikes against southern Iran.
Yeah, so the U.S. Central Command said earlier that they have struck some alleged missile sites in Iran, as well as some kind of areas that were accused of attempting to plant landmines, if you will. The U.S. Central Command said that this was a necessary operation in order to maintain its defense and to, kind of do some damage control here. But I think the reason why this is at the top page of the New York Times and every major news outlet is essentially because it calls into question whether or not this is a setback for peace talks, on top of some already mixed messaging, whether you're looking at what the Americans are saying versus what the Iranians are saying about the progress that we're at with a potential peace deal. So it's really unclear right now if this strike will essentially be accepted as the U.S. Central Command is saying, an act that could not be helped for the sake of American defense, and whether that will be understandable or whether or not this will be considered a real threat to any progress that has been made recently in peace talks.
Right, and speaking about those peace talks, Kelly, what is the latest on that front?
It's hard to say, honestly. These are closed-door talks. Journalists like myself can really only look at the official messaging from various governments. So right before this happened, the Iranian Foreign Ministry had said, and again, this is before these strikes, they had said that some progress has been made in U.S.-Iran peace talks, but that a deal was, quote, not imminent, right? So they made it sound like we're not exactly that close yet. Meanwhile, the Trump administration before this was essentially saying that a deal has been essentially largely negotiated. I think that was the exact quote. Largely negotiated is what President Trump said. Those are two very different messages, although it looks like they both at least agree that maybe they were getting closer to some kind of peace deal. The other monkey wrench in all of this is that President Trump earlier said that he would want certain nations to agree with the Abraham Accords as a prerequisite for some kind of peace deal. And so now this is getting really muddy because we're bringing in a lot of other nations that may or may not be willing to be a part of this. So for those who don't know, the Abraham Accords is basically an agreement, I believe from President Trump's first term, saying that they recognize Israel as a state. So it's about normalizing relations with Israel. I believe the UAE and Bahrain had already agreed to be a part of that in 2020, but President Trump mentioned Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Jordan as potential countries that he would want to see kind of fall in line with that for there to be progress towards peace. So as you can see, it's almost like as if he's getting closer to this feeling that he has a peace deal on the table, and now he wants to get some last-minute gets, if you will. He's trying to make this a bigger and better package for himself. And it's not really clear in light of what's going on today if that's even on the table at this point.
Right. Professor Kim, in the course of this path to a peace deal, Mr. Trump has threatened and then retreated from many warnings of military strikes. Did this stance, or does this stance share a sense of strategic restraint, or does it signal a serious limit to his leverage, do you think?
I think it's a mix of both strategic restraint and serious limits to his leverage, but what we do know is that the balance has been tipping unfavorably for Washington. Trump's patterns throughout these negotiations has been to vacillate between what we would describe as saber-rattling rhetoric and signals of readiness for further talks. For example, he has been setting deadlines, extending them, and then also occasionally walking back on some of these deadlines. And in this sense, his mix of what we would describe as bluffing, extending and disappearing deadlines, and sudden attacks has led Tehran to refuse to trust the United States and trust that the United States would even keep a temporary ceasefire. So that erosion of credibility is a real cost at this point. And earlier this year, Trump gave Iran 10 to 15 days to agree on a nuclear deal. And he warned that failure to reach an agreement would be an unfortunate for Iran. Yet those deadlines passed without the promised consequences, and Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz has become its greatest strategic leverage over Washington. This is something that no amount of rhetorical escalation has reversed. So when we look at it from this point of view, one could argue that Trump is practicing a form of what we would describe as madman theory, this idea that attempts or strategies to keep adversaries off balance is what he is utilizing. But what we're actually seeing in practice looks more like the limits of coercive pressures against an adversary that has more to lose from capitulation than from enduring pain. So in theory and in practice, it's quite different.
Right. In the meantime, Kelly, Mr. Trump's military campaign against Iran has been facing mounting opposition at home. That being said, do you suppose domestic, and by that I mean the U.S., political pressure look to perhaps shape the next phase of this conflict? And if that is the case, what might that picture look like, do you think?
Well, this mounting pressure is really showing itself in terms of polling and approval ratings for President Trump. So, I mean, there have been many moments throughout his 2 terms where he has met controversy. I'm thinking about the ICE raids and the death of 2 American citizens who were killed by federal agents. That was a really bad low point. It's even worse, according to some polls now. So President Trump has the lowest approval rating in his recorded history, so compared to his first term and also right now. I think there was a poll in the middle of this month that said that only 31% of Americans approve of what he's doing, how he's handling his job. 64% disapprove. That's his weakest showing yet. We're ramping up to the midterms. I mean, certain Democratic lawmakers are really talking about his performance in Iran as a way to persuade people away from the Republican Party. I think, he had this one blunder very recently where he said that he's not thinking about Americans' economic burden as he's going into this war, and that really did not serve well among his voter base and among the MAGA movement. If you look at the U.S. right now, I mean, we have a landscape where layoffs have hit their highest since the 2008 economic crisis. AI is really the only sector that is buoying the U.S. economy out of a recession. Trump definitely feels maybe some pressure to show a victory or package what's going on as a victory with Iran to kind of quiet this discontent. And just to show the connection, I mean, the Strait of Hormuz and the issue with the energy crisis, this is really at this point affecting an average American's bottom line. So what it's doing is it's bringing up the price of energy and oil, gasoline, which is bringing up the price of goods, because a lot of American domestic farming, for instance, is actually on the West Coast in California, and a lot of the East Coast food supply comes from there. So the cost of tomatoes, just as an example, has gone up 40%. I have American friends that were saying that they're paying $3 for one Roma tomato. I mean, that's almost like Korea prices right back in the day in terms of produce, and that's grown domestically. I mean, with Korea, a lot of it is actually imported. So you're talking about a cost of living crisis. That's really been the messaging coming from Senator Bernie Sanders in Vermont and other major Democratic opposition lawmakers. And while some, political analysts essentially say that Democrats can't celebrate this too soon, that they need to be careful, I do think that there is going to be pressure for President Trump to either find an off-ramp or try to spin what he's getting from Iran as some kind of political victory and exit. And the Iranians, on the other hand, may very well know that and use that to their advantage.
Right. Professor Kim, from a Korean perspective, does the conflict in the Middle East reinforce confidence in the U.S. alliance framework, or does it serve to perhaps raise doubts about U.S. reliability?
And to be frank, it seems like South Korea is running several calculations simultaneously regarding this, but the issue is that none of them are entirely reassuring at the moment. Now, the first we could imagine is a straightforward force posture concern. The United States repositioned some military assets from the Korean Peninsula to support operations in the Middle East. And I don't want to overstate this, but the redeployment of certain assets doesn't create an immediate security vacuum here. But it does prompt a legitimate question. In a genuine crisis on the peninsula, how quickly and fully would Washington be able to concentrate its attention and capabilities on Northeast Asia? And that kind of uncertainty regarding this question, even if it's manageable today, it's not something that Seoul can simply set aside at the moment. And another calculation, the second one, would involve Pyongyang. And watching the United States attack Iran, a country that had not fully developed nuclear weapons, Kim Jong-un will almost certainly have drawn a stark lesson from this. Surrendering your nuclear arsenal is not a plan, or is not a path to security. It's a path to vulnerability from the way that he would see it. So if anything, the Iran war has deepened Kim's conviction that his nuclear deterrent is non-negotiable. And that makes the already daunting challenge of denuclearization even more remote. So from Seoul's perspective, the Middle East conflict has inadvertently hardened the very problem South Korea needs to solve the most. And the third concern is about entrapment. So several Middle Eastern countries that hosted U.S. bases have become targets of Iranian retaliation precisely because of that hosting relationship. So South Korea is home to nearly 28,500 American troops and serves as a critical node to the U.S. Indo-Pacific posture. But the Iran war has made viscerally clear that the alliance commitments can carry a two-way risk, that being a frontline partner of the United States may invite threats that would not otherwise exist. And so this is a conversation Seoul has managed carefully, but it's now going to be even harder to avoid.
Right, and speaking about South Korea then, Kelly, as a foreign journalist based here in Seoul, what do you believe is the biggest concern for the Lee Jae-myung administration with regard to the conflict in the Middle East?
I think there's a lot going on, and it's hard to say which is the single largest issue. I mean, you have soaring energy prices, you've got issues with shipping and a largely export-driven economy, and those two issues feed each other because one of South Korea's greatest exports is obviously reliant on industry that needs this energy, semiconductor chips and the alike, appliances, electronic appliances, things like that. And then, as Professor Kim was talking about, you have this really difficult tightrope that South Korea is walking where engagement with North Korea has been a chronic issue. It certainly looks worse. South Korea has long relied on its alliance and really kind of raised that alliance to be an important part of Korean domestic politics. And now, as a frontline partner, there has been the question of why hasn't it helped the United States more on its front with Iran. I think South Korea has navigated that quite well, as has parts of Europe, but that challenge continues to exist. We saw recently President Trump kind of dithering On the question of Taiwan, that's also a serious issue that South Korea really has to look at carefully. But I mean, the situation as it stands, and we've been talking about it on the show for several months now, it's not looking great. I mean, 70% of crude oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz that South Korea is reliant on. So 70% of Korea's crude oil supply. There's been talk again and again about dealing with helium shortages, dealing with chemical shortages or component shortages that are important for things like South Korea's trash system. The Korean won is at a 17-year low. It's exceptionally bad right now, which has, you know, kind of a chokehold on Koreans who are trying to do business abroad, the Koreans who want to travel, do tourism. I think KOSPI recorded its worst ever performance in its 43-year history for a single session. So we're dealing with a situation where domestic politics is largely driven by economic concerns in North Korea, and this conflict is affecting both very greatly. And so, you know, it also plays into South Korea's broader issues with the population crisis, the birth rate. If people don't feel optimistic about their economic future, they're certainly not going to be, you know, starting families if that's already been an issue in the last 20 or 30 years. If people are uncertain about the state of peace on the peninsula and the greater region, that's not going to have a great effect on business. It's a really destabilizing time. I don't know which the Lee Jae-myung administration should be looking at. I think they've been looking at them all. And I will say, at least on the foreign policy front, I think it's been a pretty good performance so far. South Korea's done a really good job at, you know, kind of navigating this uncertain territory and carving a place on the international stage. But also, it's been good at kind of avoiding being noticed too much as well, I think, in terms of Washington seeking, you know, help from its allies.
Right. And speaking about that, Professor Kim, I'd like to circle back to your talk about North Korea. Chinese leader Xi Jinping is expected to visit North Korea in the days ahead to sit down with Kim Jong-un. What do you believe will top their agenda?
I think they're going to have many different things to talk about, but, you know, several prominent issues are likely going to top the agenda. And one major focus will likely be North Korea's relationship with the United States. Now, a separate government source has indicated that Xi Jinping could seek to mediate relations between Pyongyang and Washington. Now, this would align with the broader diplomatic context. The fact that the U.S. fact sheet released following the Trump-Xi summit stated that the two leaders confirmed their shared goals to denuclearize North Korea, suggesting Washington may be encouraging Beijing to use this visit to facilitate dialogue. So in this sense, it could potentially be a mediating actor. But at the same time, Xi Jinping's visit is unlikely to be solely about serving as an intermediary for the United States or a messenger for President Trump. Now, Beijing is increasingly concerned about North Korea's deepening military cooperation with Russia, including Pyongyang's reported provision of troops and weapons to support Moscow's war in Ukraine. And from China's perspective, there is growing concern about losing influence over North Korea as well, since as Pyongyang strengthens ties with Moscow. So as a result, reinforcing and stabilizing the China-DPRK relationship will likely be just as important as any discussion involving the United States. And President Xi Jinping will want to ensure that Beijing remains North Korea's primary strategic partner, rather than allowing Russia to become the dominant external actor shaping Pyongyang's calculations. So it seems as though even though the two will have a lot of things to talk about, balancing these relationships is going to be top priority.
All right, speaking about relationships, Kelly, Seoul has been actively pursuing talks with Washington last week. Could you walk us through some of the talks that have taken place and their relevance?
I will say, since Lee Jae-myung took office, I mean, South Korea's top diplomats have really been busy. It seems to be that South Korea is really being active and proactive, if you will, about its foreign policy. But a lot of the things that it's proposing are not necessarily, you know, earth-shattering, ground-shaking things. I think what they're doing is really seeking stability as well as a little bit of growth in terms of economic partnerships. So what we know is that South Korea's vice foreign minister in talks with Washington, essentially said that, they would like President Trump and the U.S.'s support on things like nuclear submarines, shipbuilding projects, nuclear energy projects. I mean, they've mostly gotten support, at least verbally, from the Trump administration about those initiatives in the past. Of them, the ones that have been making the news the most recently is obviously the nuclear submarines. Some of that, stirs up concern that it could kind of provoke some sort of arms race on the Korean Peninsula and in the Asia region more broadly. But like I said, President Trump has generally shown some kind of support for that. Shipbuilding cooperation, things like that have also been in the headlines. I think Korea, with its export-driven economy, is really trying to grow its presence as kind of a place of industry when it comes to defense. So, for instance, we talked about last week South Korea or Hanwha's bid to, have a big project with Canada's military. It would be, if they won, the biggest military deal in Canada's military history. It would be $12 billion plus for the South Korean economy, 20,000 jobs. So you really see in this moment of kind of greater chaos, a lot of dialogue, but mostly about business and cooperation on that front, and less about some of the more fundamental choices from Washington about the war in Iran, what's been going on in Gaza, although Lee Jae-myung, the president, has certainly been vocal about some of the issues that have been going on in terms of Israel's conduct. But generally, you see kind of moves that are not trying to shake up these relationships, but really trying to create a stronghold of more kind of economic cooperation, more potential for, output for South Korea's GDP. And that might be the right rope to walk right now.
Right. And in the meantime, Professor Kim, how should South Korea seek to navigate the potential scenario of the U.S. re-engaging with North Korea?
So I think the Iran president cuts in complicated ways for North Korea. On the one hand, the emerging U.S.-Iran framework involves a 60-day ceasefire extension, sanctions relief negotiations, and eventual talks on curbing Iran's nuclear program. A phased transactional approach that Kim Jong-un will have studied closely. And so if Trump achieves even a partial agreement with Tehran, his team will likely pivot to North Korea with a similar playbook. And that's economic incentives in exchange for nuclear concessions. But on the other hand, since Pyongyang has bolstered ties with Moscow and Beijing, it is now far less motivated to engage Washington than it was during the first Trump administration, and has shown little appetite for inter-Korean engagement, as we've seen recently the past few years. And it has disavowed unification and flatly rejected Seoul's overtures. So Kim has learned from watching both the Libya model and the Iran experience that surrendering strategic assets offers no lasting security guarantee. So for Seoul, the navigation challenge is delicate. If Trump pursues a bilateral deal with Kim, potentially trading sanctions relief for a partial freeze rather than full denuclearization, South Korea risks being excluded from a process that directly determines its own security. And Seoul should actively be signaling to Washington that any arrangement on the peninsula must account for South Korean interests and inter-Korean dimensions. And President Lee Jae-myung, during his state visit to China in January, asked President Xi Jinping to help mediate inter-Korean relations. So that kind of multilateral diplomatic engagement, alongside firm alliance coordination with the United States, is Seoul's best hedge against being left out of decisions made about Korea, but without Korea.
Right, I see. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this edition. Professor Kim, as always, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you for having me.
And Kelly here in the studio, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thanks.
All right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching, and see you back here same time tomorrow.